My husband told his coworkers I was his sister. It took me years to find out why. Throwaway account, because my real one has people from that office following it, and I'm not ready for any of them to see this yet, if I ever am. This is long. I need it to be long, because the short version makes Adrian sound like a monster, and the truth is so much stranger and so much sadder than that, and I want the whole thing on record somewhere, even anonymously, even just for myself. I found out my husband had been introducing me as his sister at work for years, because a woman at his company's holiday party asked me, with genuine, gentle concern in her voice, whether things had been getting any easier since the divorce. I told her I wasn't sure what she meant, since I'd never been divorced, and she looked at me with an expression that shifted, in the space of about 2 seconds, from sympathy to confusion to something close to alarm. "You're Adrian's sister, right?" she asked. "Nora," I said yes, because that much was true. My name is Nora. And then I said, slowly, feeling something cold settle into my stomach even before I understood exactly why, "I'm his wife. We've been married for 6 years." Every single person in that room, I would learn over the following 20 minutes, standing near a table of half-eaten appetizers while my husband laughed at something across the room, completely unaware his entire professional identity was collapsing 8 feet away from him, believed I was his sister. Not his coworker's assumption. Not a joke gone stale. A story Adrian had apparently been telling, carefully and consistently, for years. The question I couldn't get past, standing there holding a plastic cup of wine I no longer wanted, wasn't really who he'd told them I was. It was why. And it would take me the better part of a year, and more devastation than I ever expected to survive in one marriage, to actually find out. I'm 31. I work as an architectural designer for a small firm that mostly handles residential renovations. Careful, detail-oriented work that suits my personality better than almost anything else I could imagine doing. Adrian is 34, a senior project manager at a large engineering firm downtown. The kind of job that comes with holiday parties in rented event spaces and a company culture built around a specific, polished kind of professionalism. We met almost 8 years ago at a mutual friend's dinner party, married 2 years after that, and up until that holiday party, I would have told you, without hesitation, that our marriage was a good one. Adrian is calm in a way I've always found steadying, socially fluent in situations that make me anxious, dependable about the ordinary logistics of a shared life in a way that made me trust him without ever really having to think about it. He rarely raises his voice. He's the kind of person who remembers, unprompted, that you mentioned a headache 3 days ago and asks if it's better. I want to be honest that this isn't the setup to a story about a marriage that was secretly terrible the whole time. It wasn't. That's what made the holiday party so disorienting. I found Adrian across the room a few minutes after that conversation, still processing what I just learned, unsure exactly how to even begin asking him about it in a room full of his colleagues. I pulled him aside near the coat check, kept my voice low, and told him what had just happened, watching his face carefully for whatever reaction would tell me how to feel about it. He didn't look panicked, exactly. He looked, if anything, tired, like a man being asked to explain something he'd hoped he'd have more time before explaining. "It's not what it sounds like," he said, glancing past me toward the room like he was checking who might be listening. "My workplace is just, I don't like mixing my personal life with work, Nora. I've never really talked about my marriage here. I think at some point early on, someone asked about you, and I said something vague about a sister, and it just sort of stuck. I never corrected it because it never seemed important enough to correct. I remember standing there turning that explanation over, wanting badly to accept it, because the alternative explanations forming in the back of my mind were considerably worse. He didn't seem defensive so much as embarrassed, apologetic in a low-key way that felt, at the time, more consistent with an oversight than a lie. I let it go that night. I told myself it was strange, but not sinister, the kind of thing you'd bring up once more, gently, and then never think about again. Except I did think about it again, more and more over the following weeks, the way you do with something that doesn't fully add up no matter how many times you rearrange the pieces trying to make it fit. I started noticing things I'd apparently been quietly not noticing for years, small details that had always been there, technically, if I'd ever thought to look at them as a pattern instead of as isolated, unrelated facts about our life together. Adrian never wore his wedding ring to work events. I'd always assumed it was for safety reasons around machinery on site visits, a reasonable-sounding explanation he'd given me early in our marriage that I'd simply absorbed and never questioned since. None of his coworkers had ever seen our wedding photographs, not even the handful of people he'd worked alongside for the better part of a decade. We'd never once hosted anyone from his office at our house, not for a barbecue, not for a holiday gathering, nothing, in 6 years of marriage. And I'd always chalked that up to Adrian's general preference for keeping work and home separate, a preference that had always seemed reasonable enough on its own that I'd never thought to interrogate it as part of a larger pattern. I scrolled through his work phone one evening, not sneaking exactly, just glancing at it while it sat charging on the counter, and realized there were almost no references to me anywhere in it, not in his contacts beyond a single entry under my first name, not in any photos, nothing that would tell a stranger looking through that phone that he was a married man at all. There was a night, a few weeks after the holiday party, when his phone rang while we were eating dinner, a coworker calling about some scheduling issue for the next day, and I heard him answer, easy and casual, and at one point in the conversation he said, clearly, referring to me, "No, Nora's actually got a work thing that night too," using my first name the way you'd refer to a sibling or a friend, not the small. Automatic, my wife, that had always been his habit when talking about me to people who knew us both. I sat there finishing my dinner, telling myself it meant nothing, that plenty of people refer to their spouses by name in casual conversation, that I was reading tension into an ordinary sentence because I'd been primed to look for it since the party. But something about the specific ease of it, how naturally it fit into the rhythm of the call, made the explanation harder to hold on to than it had been a few weeks earlier. When I asked him, a few days later, gently, what exactly he'd told people at his office about us over the years, beyond the sister thing, he got quiet in a way that wasn't quite defensive but wasn't quite comfortable either, and said, "Can we not do this again? I told you, it's not a big deal. I don't like talking about my personal life at work. That's it." I let it drop again. I want to be honest that I'm not proud of how many times, over those first few months, I let things drop. I mentioned all of it to my best friend Mara over drinks one night, mostly venting, the way you do when something feels wrong, but you don't yet have language sharp enough to explain exactly why. Mara has never liked Adrian in the specific, low-grade way some close friends never quite warm to a partner, not because of anything dramatic, just an instinct she's carried since we started dating that she's never fully explained even to herself. She listened to the whole thing, quiet and focused in the way she gets when she's actually taking something seriously instead of just being agreeable. "I'm not saying he's cheating," she said finally, which surprised me because I'd half expected that to be her first theory. "I don't think this reads like cheating, honestly. Cheaters usually want you kept away from specific people, not erased from an entire category of his life. This feels like something else. I don't know what yet, but something else." I didn't fully understand what she meant at the time. I would understand it much better, months later, once I finally had the full picture. The conversation that actually cracked the whole thing open happened almost by accident, at a work event I hadn't originally planned to attend. A smaller gathering for a project milestone that Adrian mentioned almost in passing, the kind of thing I would normally have skipped, except that a friend of mine happened to be catering it, and I'd gone mostly to say hello to her. I ended up talking, for maybe 20 minutes, with one of Adrian's coworkers, a friendly, slightly awkward man named Ethan Vale who worked on Adrian's team, and who, it became clear almost immediately, assumed I already knew everything he was about to tell me. "It's so nice Adrian finally has you back in his life more," he said, apropos of very little, somewhere in the middle of an otherwise ordinary conversation about the project. I asked him what he meant, careful to keep my voice neutral, genuinely unsure yet whether I was about to learn something significant or simply misunderstand another ordinary comment the way I apparently had for years. "You know, the whole sister thing," he said, a little sheepishly, like he was worried he'd overstepped some boundary by bringing it up at all. "Adrian's always been kind of private about family stuff. Whenever anyone brings it up, he gets weird. I just figured, it's good you two are close again." I asked him, as evenly as I could manage, how long people at the office had believed I was Adrian's sister. He thought about it for a moment, genuinely trying to be accurate rather than evasive. As long as I've worked with him, honestly. 5 years, maybe. It's just sort of always been the story. I asked him what exactly Adrian had said about our family, and Ethan, increasingly uncomfortable as he seemed to sense he was somewhere he shouldn't be, told me that Adrian had apparently mentioned, at some point years earlier, that our parents were both gone, that it was just the two of us, and that people had generally learned not to push much further than that because Adrian's whole demeanor changed whenever the subject came up. "He always gets weird when anyone asks about your family," Ethan said, and something in that specific phrasing, your family, not his, made my stomach drop in a way I hadn't fully braced for. I didn't confront Adrian that night. I went home and sat with it instead, turning the timeline over in my head, trying to understand how a story like that gets built and maintained for 5 years without ever once slipping, without a single photograph or offhand comment ever contradicting it in front of the wrong person. It didn't feel like an oversight anymore, the way he'd originally framed it. It felt like architecture, something built deliberately, load-bearing, maintained with real care over a long period of time. I started paying closer attention after that, not confronting him outright, but simply watching. The way you watch a building you suspect has a structural problem, looking for the small signs that would tell you where the actual damage was. I also, around this same period, reached out to Adrian's supervisor, a composed, sharp-eyed woman named Clara Bennett, who had worked with him for nearly the entire span of his career at the firm, and who I'd met exactly twice before, both times briefly, both times without ever once being introduced to her as anything other than, apparently, Adrian's sister. I called her under the pretense of a work-related question Adrian had supposedly asked me to relay. A small deception I wasn't proud of, but that felt necessary if I wanted an honest read on anything before Adrian could manage the conversation the way he'd clearly managed every other conversation about our relationship for years. Clara was cordial at first, professionally warm in the practiced way of someone used to fielding calls from employees' families, and it was only when I mentioned, carefully, that I was actually his wife rather than his sister, that something in her tone shifted into a more guarded, considering silence. "I did wonder once or twice," she said finally, choosing her words with visible care. "Adrian's always been private. More private than most people I've managed, honestly, and I've managed a lot of people over the years. I never pushed him on it, because early on, when he first started here, he went through something that made me want to give him space rather than pressure him for details." I asked her what she meant, and she hesitated before answering, clearly weighing how much she felt comfortable saying about an employee's personal history to someone she'd only just learned was actually his wife. There was a period, maybe 2 years into his time here, when he came into my office looking like he hadn't slept in days, asked for an unusual amount of unpaid leave without much explanation, and when he came back, he was different, quieter, more careful about what he shared. I always assumed something had happened with his family, but he never said what, and I never asked directly. I just made sure he had room to work the way he needed to. I thanked her, told her I appreciated her time, and sat with that information for a long while afterward, understanding that whatever had happened during that unexplained leave had likely marked the real beginning of the sister story. Not some casual, forgettable misunderstanding at all, but a deliberate reconstruction of his entire professional identity, following something significant enough to fundamentally change how he moved through the rest of his working life. The affair theory took hold somewhere around that point, mostly because it was the explanation that made the most immediate, familiar sense out of everything else feeling wrong. If Adrian was hiding our marriage from his coworkers, maybe it was because there was someone else he didn't want them connecting to me. Some tangle of relationships he was managing that made a fictional sister considerably more convenient than an actual wife. I started noticing, over the following weeks, that he'd taken to leaving the house on Thursday evenings, always with some version of a work explanation, a late meeting, a client dinner, nothing individually suspicious, but building, again, into a pattern once I started actually tracking it instead of accepting each excuse at face value. I followed him one Thursday, feeling faintly sick about it the entire drive, parking a block away from an old restaurant on the edge of downtown that I'd never once heard him mention before. I watched him go inside. I watched, through the window, as he sat down across from a woman I didn't recognize, older than either of us, dressed carefully in a way that read more professional than romantic once I actually looked closely. Though in that first disorienting moment, my mind went immediately to the worst possible conclusion anyway. I sat in my car for almost 40 minutes, watching through the restaurant window, and the longer I watched, the less the scene matched what I'd braced myself to see. They weren't sitting close together. There was no easy physical familiarity between them, none of the small, unconscious signals that usually give away an actual romantic connection, even at a distance. Adrian kept glancing toward the restaurant's front window every few minutes, as though checking whether anyone outside might be watching, a habit I'd never once noticed in him before, and that made my own hunched position in the driver's seat feel suddenly, uncomfortably conspicuous. At one point, the woman reached into a bag beside her and handed Adrian a plain manila envelope, and I watched him take it with an expression that had nothing to do with guilt or romance at all. He looked frightened. Genuinely, visibly frightened, in a way I don't think I'd ever seen on his face in 8 years of knowing him. He opened the envelope at the table, glanced at whatever was inside for only a few seconds, and then closed it again quickly, tucking it into his jacket like something he needed out of sight immediately. I drove home before he left the restaurant, my mind racing through explanations that no longer had anything to do with infidelity at all. I second-guessed almost everything I'd seen that night for days afterward. The way you do when the story your instincts are building feels too strange to trust over the far more familiar shape of an ordinary betrayal. I told myself more than once that I'd probably misread the whole scene, that fear and guilt can look similar enough at a distance through a restaurant window, that an older woman handing a younger man an envelope could mean almost anything at all. A loan, a legal document, some family matter that had nothing to do with me. I even called Mara that week specifically to talk myself back into the affair theory, half-hoping she'd agree with me simply so I could stop turning over a stranger possibility that felt, if I was honest, considerably more frightening than an ordinary infidelity would have been. She wouldn't let me do that. "You watched a man take an envelope from a woman and looked terrified," she said. "That's not what cheating looks like, Nora. I know it would almost be easier if it was, but you know that's not what you saw." I hated that she was right. It took me almost 2 weeks of careful, quiet digging to figure out who the woman was, mostly through a photograph I managed to get a decent look at on a professional networking site once I had enough of a physical description to search from. Her name was Inez Calloway, and her listed occupation, to my genuine surprise, was investigative journalist, freelance, with a handful of published pieces over the years focused on corporate fraud and financial crime. I sat with that information for a long time, unable to make it fit into any version of the story I'd been building in my head. If Adrian wasn't having an affair, and he clearly wasn't, based on everything I'd actually observed, then what exactly was he doing meeting secretly, on a regular schedule, with a journalist who investigated financial crime, frightened enough by whatever was in that envelope that his hands had been visibly unsteady handling it? I started looking into Adrian's family after that, something I realized, with a small, uncomfortable jolt, that I'd never actually done in any serious way in 8 years together, mostly because he'd always kept that part of his life so thoroughly closed off that I'd simply learned, early on, not to push. He'd told me, in the first year we dated, that his father had abandoned the family when Adrian was a teenager, walked out with no warning and no explanation, and that he hadn't spoken to him since. I'd accepted that story the way you accept most things a partner tells you about their own painful history, without demanding evidence, because asking someone to prove their own childhood trauma felt like its own kind of cruelty. But once I actually started searching, carefully, using nothing more than public records and old newspaper archives, I found a version of events that didn't line up cleanly with what Adrian had always told me. I found an old newspaper article, nearly 20 years old, discussing a financial scandal involving a mid-sized investment firm, one that had collapsed after allegations of fraud involving several of its senior partners. One of the names listed among those partners was Samuel Whitmore. I sat with that name for a long moment before the obvious connections settled into place. I also found, buried in an even older set of local records, evidence that Adrian himself had briefly gone by a different surname for a period during his teenage years, something he'd never once mentioned to me in 8 years of marriage, changed back, according to the records, sometime around the same period the financial scandal was unfolding. None of it told me exactly what had happened. But it told me, unmistakably, that whatever version of his own history Adrian had given me wasn't the complete one, and that something significant had happened in his family that he'd been carrying, alone, for the entire time I'd known him. I confronted him with all of it on a Sunday evening, laying out what I'd found on our kitchen table with a calm I didn't entirely feel, and watched something in his face finally, visibly give out. The careful composure he'd maintained through every previous conversation about any of this simply collapsing under the weight of what I was holding in front of him. He admitted, finally, plainly, that he had been telling coworkers I was his sister, for years, deliberately, not as some accidental misunderstanding that had simply never been corrected. I asked him why. He was quiet for a long moment before saying, "I was trying to protect you." I asked, my voice not entirely steady. "From who?" He wouldn't answer that question, not that night. He sat there at our own kitchen table, a man I'd been married to for 6 years, and told me, with something that looked almost like relief at finally saying even this much out loud, that there were things about his family he'd never told me, things he'd hoped he would never need to tell me, and that he genuinely believed, at the time and apparently still, that keeping our marriage separate from his professional life had been the safest thing he could do for me. I asked him to explain what safest even meant in this context, what exactly he thought I needed protecting from, and he simply shook his head and said he wasn't ready to explain the rest yet, that he needed more time, and something in me broke a little differently than it had at the holiday party, because this wasn't a strange misunderstanding anymore. This was a man who had made a significant decision about my own life, my own safety, apparently, without ever once telling me there was a decision being made at all. I spent the following weeks doing my own investigating in earnest, no longer willing to simply wait for Adrian to decide when I was ready to hear the rest of it. I reached out to my own mother, something I hadn't seriously considered until that point, because my father had died when I was young, in circumstances my mother had always described vaguely as business trouble that led to his disappearance, and years later, his confirmed death, details she'd never elaborated on beyond a general, painful unwillingness to revisit that period of our lives. I drove out to see her in person rather than asking over the phone, because some part of me understood, even before I fully articulated it to myself, that this particular conversation deserved to happen in a room together rather than across a distance either of us could hang up on. We sat at her kitchen table, the same table I'd done homework at as a child, and I asked her, more directly than I ever had before, what she actually remembered about that time, about what exactly my father had been involved in before he disappeared. She was quiet for a long moment, turning her coffee cup slowly the way I realized, with a strange jolt, was almost exactly the same nervous habit I'd watched Inez Calloway display in that restaurant weeks earlier. "I've spent 20 years telling myself I was protecting you from something too painful to explain," she said finally. "I think I was mostly protecting myself." She told me, haltingly, about a business dispute my father had been tangled up in during the final year of his life, about people he'd stopped trusting, about nights near the end when he'd come home unable to eat, packing the house long after she'd gone to bed. She told me about a specific name he'd mentioned to her once, in fear, shortly before he vanished, a name she'd never repeated to another living soul in the 2 decades since. Samuel Whitmore. I asked her why she'd never told me, even once, even years later when I was old enough to understand. "Because for a long time," she said, "I believed the story everyone else believed, that your father had done something wrong and run from it." It wasn't until years later, piecing together small things, that I started doubting that. And by then, Nora, what was I supposed to do with a doubt I had no way to prove? I sat with that revelation for a long time after leaving her house that evening, feeling the entire architecture of my own marriage rearrange itself around a connection I never could have anticipated. Adrian's father and my father had been connected, decades earlier, in whatever scandal had eventually destroyed the investment firm and driven Adrian's family apart. Which meant, somehow, that Adrian's world and my own had been tangled together long before either of us was ever born into the specific shape of it, long before that dinner party 8 years ago, where we'd supposedly met by simple, ordinary chance. I confronted Adrian again once I had that peace, and this time he didn't deflect the way he had before. He told me, finally, that he had known my surname before we ever met, that his own father, years earlier, had specifically warned him to stay away from anyone connected to my family, a warning Adrian had apparently carried, uneasily, for years without fully understanding why it mattered as much as his father seemed to believe it did. He told me that meeting me at that dinner party hadn't been entirely the coincidence I'd always believed it to be, that some part of him had recognized my last name the moment we were introduced and felt something close to alarm at first, quickly followed, he insisted, by something considerably more genuine. "I fell in love with you," he said, sitting across from me with an expression more open and afraid than I think I'd ever seen from him. "That part was never a lie, Nora. But I also never told you the rest of it, and I understand now that not telling you was its own kind of decision I had no right to make on your behalf." He explained that not long after we started seriously dating, someone connected to his father's old business circle had apparently recognized my name somewhere, mentioned it back to Samuel. And Adrian had panicked, terrified that if the wrong people understood, he'd married into the family of a man his own father had once wronged. It might put me at some kind of risk. He didn't fully understand himself yet. So he'd started keeping our marriage separate from his professional life, hiding me from an entire category of his existence, believing, in some genuinely frightened, poorly reasoned way, that keeping my identity compartmentalized would somehow keep me safer. It wasn't a complete or satisfying explanation, and I told him so, sitting there feeling something between relief at finally having real information and a fresh, different kind of anger at understanding just how much he'd decided on my behalf without ever once asking whether I wanted that kind of protection at all. "You don't get to call it protection," I told him, "when you never gave me the choice." He didn't argue with that. He just sat there, quiet, absorbing it, and eventually said, "I thought protecting someone meant carrying the fear by myself instead of putting it on you too." I told him that wasn't protection. That was control, dressed up in language that made it easier for him to live with. There was still more, and I could feel it sitting underneath everything he'd told me so far, an incompleteness to his explanation that Mara, when I finally told her the whole story so far, picked up on immediately. "Why was he meeting a journalist, specifically?" she asked, cutting straight to the piece that still didn't fit cleanly into anything Adrian had admitted to. "If this was only ever about protecting you from a vague old family scandal, why does a financial crimes reporter need to be involved at all?" I didn't have an answer yet. I went back to Adrian with that exact question, and this time, his answer finally connected the last remaining pieces. He admitted that his relationship with Inez Calloway wasn't recent at all, that he'd been working with her, on and off, for nearly 3 years, ever since he'd first learned enough about his own father's past to start seriously questioning the version of events he'd grown up believing. He told me that he'd never fully accepted his father's account of what happened at that old investment firm, that something about it had always sat wrong with him, especially once he was old enough to start piecing together fragments his mother had let slip over the years before her own death. He'd started, quietly, investigating on his own, and eventually connected with Inez, whose earlier reporting on corporate fraud had touched tangentially on some of the same names involved in his father's old firm. Together, over years, they'd been slowly assembling evidence, and somewhere in the middle of that long, careful process, Adrian had discovered something that reshaped his entire understanding of what had actually happened decades earlier. My father hadn't been one of the people responsible for the fraud at all. He'd been one of the people trying, quietly, to expose it, before he disappeared under circumstances that had never been properly investigated at the time. I sat with that revelation longer than almost anything else in this entire story, because it meant the version of my father I'd grown up with, distant and unexplained, was wrong in a way that reshaped an entire childhood of quiet, unspoken family grief. My mother had never fully known what happened either, only that my father had grown increasingly afraid in his final months, that he'd stopped trusting certain people, that he'd talked, once, about needing to make things right before whatever had frightened him caught up with the rest of us. Adrian told me, gently, that the evidence he and Inez had been assembling for years suggested my father had uncovered proof that Samuel Whitmore had personally orchestrated the fraud that eventually collapsed the firm, and had been building toward exposing it publicly before he disappeared. Samuel, according to what Adrian had pieced together, had allowed the entire narrative afterward to shift blame quietly onto the very people who'd been trying to stop him, my father included, a betrayal so complete that it had scattered both families in different directions for decades, until Adrian and I, entirely by what had genuinely felt like chance at the time, ended up at the same dinner party. "So the sister's story," I asked, my voice quieter than it had been through most of this conversation, wasn't really about protecting me from some vague old scandal. It was about keeping me separate from an active investigation into your own father, one you'd been secretly running for years, because you were afraid of what he might do if he understood exactly who I was and what you were doing. Adrian nodded slowly, not defending himself against the accusation, simply confirming it. "I was afraid of both things," he said. "I was afraid of what my father might do to protect himself if he understood I was investigating him and married to your family at the same time. And I was afraid of what it would do to you, to actually understand what all of this meant, before I had enough evidence to actually finish it and make it matter." I asked him the question that had been building in me since Ethan first mentioned, at that smaller work event, how long the sister story had been running. Whether he'd started investigating his father before we married, or whether some part of marrying me had been connected, even a little, to what he was trying to uncover. He didn't answer right away. When he finally did, his voice was lower than I'd heard it in the entire conversation. "I need to be honest with you about something I've never said out loud to anyone, including Inez," he said. "When I first met you, before I knew you at all, some very small, very ugly part of me was curious whether your family might know something about my father's past that could help me. I didn't approach you because of that. I promise you that. But it was there, at the beginning, sitting underneath everything else. And I think I owe you the truth about that too, even though it's not the part of this I'm proud of." I didn't respond to that for a long time. I sat at our kitchen table, the same table where he'd first admitted, weeks earlier, that he'd been telling people I was his sister, and let that new piece of information settle into everything else I now understood about the entire architecture of our marriage. It meant that whatever had started between us, at that dinner party 8 years ago, had never been entirely uncomplicated, not even at the very beginning, before either of us had any real stakes in each other beyond simple curiosity. It meant genuine love, and a kind of quiet, self-interested calculation had apparently existed together, from nearly the very start, in a way I didn't think I could simply untangle into one clean, comfortable story about either of us. I left for a few weeks after that conversation, staying with Mara, not out of some dramatic, final decision, but because I needed distance to actually think clearly about any of it without Adrian's presence in the room shaping every conclusion I tried to reach. He didn't call constantly, didn't show up uninvited, didn't do any of the things I half expected from a man suddenly afraid of losing what he'd spent years, in his own complicated way, trying to protect. He respected the distance, which surprised me more than I expected it to, given everything else I now understood about how much he'd previously decided on my behalf without asking. Mara, for her part, was careful during those weeks not to push me toward any particular conclusion, which I appreciated more than I told her at the time, because I think some part of me expected her to use the whole situation as vindication for every doubt she'd carried about Adrian since the beginning. She didn't. "I was wrong about what I thought this was," she told me one night, the two of us sitting on her couch with takeout containers going cold on the coffee table between us. "I thought he was hiding another woman, This is so much stranger than that, and honestly, I don't know what I'd have done in his position either if I genuinely believed telling you the truth put you in danger. I just don't know if believing that gave him the right to decide for you. That distinction, believing something gave him a reason versus giving him an actual right, sat with me for the rest of that stay, turning over slowly in the back of my mind, through long, unstructured days that felt strange after years of a routine built entirely around a marriage I no longer fully understood. I spent those weeks talking more with my mother than I had in years, learning pieces of my father's final months that she'd never felt able to share before, partly, she admitted, because she'd never fully understood them herself until Adrian's evidence started filling in gaps that had sat unexplained in our family for over 2 decades. I met with Inez Calloway directly, once, at Adrian's suggestion, in a quiet coffee shop far enough from either of our usual routines that neither of us worried about being recognized. She was more guarded in person than I'd expected, understandably careful about what she could confirm given the sensitivity of an investigation still technically ongoing. But she walked me, patiently, through the broad shape of what she and Adrian had been building for years. He came to me almost 3 years ago, she told me, with a handful of documents he didn't fully understand yet, and a suspicion he was clearly terrified to say out loud. I've worked with a lot of sources over the years who were afraid of getting something wrong. I don't think I've worked with many who were more afraid of getting it right. I asked her, directly, whether she thought Adrian's reasons for hiding our marriage held up, whether the danger he'd been so afraid of was actually real or whether it had become, over time, a story he told himself to justify a decision that had started reasonably and calcified into something closer to habit. She considered the question for a long moment before answering. I think the danger was real early on, when Samuel still had more to lose and fewer people watching him, she said. I think by the last year or two, Adrian could probably have told you the truth without the same level of risk, and didn't, because by then the secret had become its own kind of load-bearing wall in his life. That's not an excuse. It's just, in my experience, usually how these things actually work. I thanked her for her honesty, and something about hearing that assessment from someone entirely outside the marriage, someone with no particular investment in softening it for my benefit, made it land differently than anything Adrian himself had told me. Months later, once the investigation Adrian and Inez had been building for years finally reached a point where it could be handed to actual authorities, Adrian sent me the full evidence file himself, along with a letter I've read more times than I probably should admit. The evidence, thoroughly documented, established clearly that my father had never been involved in any wrongdoing at the old investment firm, that he had, in fact, spent his final months trying to expose Samuel Whitmore's fraud before he disappeared under circumstances that, while still not entirely resolved, no longer carried the unspoken shadow of suspicion that had quietly followed our family for over 20 years. The letter accompanying it was different from anything Adrian had said to me directly. He wrote that he understood I might never fully trust him the same way again, and that he wasn't asking me to pretend the last several years hadn't happened the way they actually happened. He wrote that he'd spent so long believing that carrying difficult truths alone was a form of love that he'd never properly considered whether it was actually just a form of control that happened to feel, from the inside, like protection. He wrote that he understood, now, that the two things aren't the same, even when they can look almost identical from where you're standing inside them. I didn't respond to that letter for almost 2 months. I want to be honest that I still don't fully know what I believe about the earliest part of our relationship, whether the curiosity he admitted to feeling, at the very beginning, before he really knew me, changes the shape of everything that came afterward, or whether it's possible, the way he insists it is, for something to start with a small, uncomfortable motive and still become entirely real once you're actually inside it. I think, most days now, that both things can be true at once, the way Adrian himself eventually came to understand about his own choices, that the marriage contained genuine love and genuine deception simultaneously, layered over each other in a way that doesn't resolve cleanly into a single, simple verdict, no matter how many times I turn it over. I ran into Ethan Vale, of all people, at a grocery store a few months after everything had mostly settled into whatever shape it was going to take, and he asked me, awkwardly, clearly unsure whether it was appropriate to ask at all. "So are you and Adrian? Are you still married?" I stood there for a moment longer than the question probably called for, thinking about how to actually answer it honestly instead of just giving him whatever version would end the conversation fastest. "We're figuring it out," I told him, which was true, and which was also, I realized as I said it, the most honest answer I had for myself as much as for him. Adrian and I still see each other, carefully, slowly, neither of us rushing toward some clean resolution that would make this story easier to tell at parties. We haven't formally separated. We also haven't simply gone back to the life we had before that holiday party, because I don't think that life, the one I believed I understood completely for 6 years, was ever quite as simple as I thought it was while I was living inside it. I think, most days, that I'm rebuilding something with him rather than repairing something, which feels like an important difference, even if I can't always articulate exactly why. I used to think being someone's wife meant knowing everything about them, every meaningful fact laid out plainly, nothing held back in the name of protection or fear or old family grudges neither of us had chosen. I think now it means something closer to being allowed to know them, gradually, honestly, as they're actually able to share it, rather than having someone else decide, quietly and alone, what you're permitted to understand about your own life. Adrian spent years deciding what I was allowed to know. I'm still working out what it looks like to build something with someone who's finally, actually trying to stop doing that, and I don't know yet whether the answer is a future together or simply a more honest ending than the one we might have had otherwise. Either way, for the first time since that holiday party, I feel like I actually know which story I'm living inside of. That turns out to matter more than I expected it to. Edit. For everyone asking, no, Samuel Whitmore has not been formally charged with anything yet, and I'm not going to share more detail than that while things are still moving through the appropriate channels. To the people asking whether I've forgiven Adrian, I think forgiveness and rebuilding trust turned out to be two entirely separate processes for me, running on two entirely different timelines, and I'm somewhere in the middle of both of them, most days a little further along than I was the month before.